I hope you're taking notes for your TBR because today I'm going to be talking about my best books of the year so far. And by that, I mean my favourite book from every month of the first half of 2026. So I'm going to be talking about a couple of books today that you're probably not going to see on my best books of the year video because not all months are created equal. So maybe my best book of January is not as good as any of the books that I read in May, and therefore by the time we get to the end of the year, that particular book won't be featured. It just happened to be the best of the bunch in that month. But all of these books are still ones that I thoroughly enjoyed and ones that I would recommend to you guys. Otherwise, they wouldn't be in this video at all. This video also marks the first installment of my mid-year content, so if you are a regular on this channel you will know exactly what you have to come, but for those of you who are a little newer here, welcome, thank you for joining us, and you have a whole slew of mid-year recap content to look forward to, with the next video being my mid-year book freakout tag, which also serves as a marker for my booktube birthday. But today is all about celebrating the best of the last 6 months, so we're going to get right into doing just that, starting of course with my best book of January, which was Deep End by Ali Hazelwood. Now this is actually not one of my favourite Ali Hazelwood books, but Ali Hazelwood is still my favourite contemporary romance author, so I still really enjoyed it. This one in particular is Ali Hazelwood's take on a sports romance, but both of the characters are still also involved in STEM. There is actually a cameo in here from some characters that we've seen before in some of Ali Hazelwood's earlier books, because the university that these two characters are attending is the same university that some of the characters that we've read from before work at, which if you are also an Ali Hazelwood fan, I think you'll know exactly who I mean. But this one is following Scarlett and Lucas, who are both professional swimmers, and Scarlett is recovering from an injury, so this has really shaken her confidence, especially when it comes to swimming, but this is something that kind of permeates the rest of her life as well. And one of the personal themes that we follow throughout this novel is Scarlett gaining confidence in all of these different elements of her life and kind of advocating for herself a little bit more and also trusting herself. Scarlett is somebody who also doesn't have a lot of friends, so she very much values a blossoming relationship she has with a member of the swim team, and she overhears this girl having a conversation with her boyfriend where she figures out that the boyfriend, who is our male main character Lucas, is potentially into some kinkier things than her friend is. So eventually those two break up amicably. They've been together for a long time. It was kind of a trauma bond, but they decide to call it quits and move on. But there is this kind of attitude that eventually they are going to find their way back to each other because they're inevitable and they're meant to be, but they're just at the minute going to explore other options. So when this friend is drunk one day, she kind of jokingly says that Scarlett and Lucas should hook up because they're into the same things in the bedroom, and eventually they do just that, pursuing a physical relationship, which obviously, as this is a contemporary romance, is going to blossom into something a little bit more. I was a little bit more nervous going into this one because over recent years Ali Hazelwood has shifted to more physical relationships than the traditional rom-com style that she originally started out with things like The Love Hypothesis and Love on the Brain, and I definitely prefer like a slow build into an intimate relationship in a book as opposed to that starting to develop a lot earlier in the book. However, I do feel like Ali Hazelwood still did a really good job of maintaining the sexual tension and chemistry between her characters that I have come to know and love from her, and so I was still very much invested in the romantic relationship developing between Scarlett and Lucas. And while the physical relationship does progress quite quickly in here, we do have a slower progression with the emotional build to this relationship, which I thought worked really well to maintain the tension for the reader. The reason why this turned out not to be one of my favourite Ali Hazelwood books is because of the conflict in this book, which did irritate me quite a bit. The way that some of the characters behave regarding a third party character in this book, like somebody not included in this relationship, was really frustrating to me, especially given their actions in every other instance where this third character wasn't present. And every time this character appeared on the page, I was getting more and more annoyed because I felt like the two main characters weren't asserting themselves enough or doing the right thing or acting in line with how they'd behaved in the past to resolve this issue, causing it to drag on for a lot longer than it needed to. So while I'm glad that the emotional build was slower throughout this book, the way that the emotional relationship was halted by this third character was incredibly frustrating to me. But I still love Ali Hazelwood. I still really enjoyed this one. This probably won't be one of the ones that I reread, but I do of course still really love Ali Hazelwood. I really enjoyed this book and I would still recommend it. A book that I'm pretty sure is going to be on my best books of the year list is my favorite from February, and that is The Raven Scholar by Antonia Hodgson. This was on a lot of people's best books of 2025 list, so I went into it with high hopes, but I'm still surprised at how much I enjoyed it, especially because this contains one of my least favorite elements, which is a murder mystery. But this is set in a world with animal gods, and the emperor is about to retire, and whenever this happens there is a competition held to decide who is going to be the next emperor. So a representative from the monastery of each of the animal gods is put forward to compete, and whichever one wins will of course be the next emperor. Straightforward, right? Except it's not, because the Raven candidate has been murdered, and our main character Nima is somebody who has never really been accepted in this world, especially amongst the ravens, but she is an incredibly gifted scholar and holds a high position in the government. So she is tasked with not only filling in for the Raven candidate, but also with finding the murderer. Now, there are a couple of things that I really loved about this, and Antonia Hodgson's writing style is one of them. The world building in here is pretty complex, and I really love that Antonia Hodgson takes the time to really flesh it out while still keeping the story moving forward. Before this, Antonia Hodgson was a crime writer. This is the first fantasy book that she's written, and that blew my mind when I found that out, because reading this, it felt so organically fantasy. Like, this felt like an author who has been at this for a really long time with how meticulous the world building and the plot development was. My other favorite thing about this book is the way that the plot reveals unfold. I think that that is where Antonia Hodgson's crime writing background really comes to the forefront, in the way that we discover things about some of these characters, about the world, about the plot, that answer questions that honestly I wasn't even asking. The world building in here in a lot of ways reminded me of authors like Brandon Sanderson, where the world feels so fleshed out and developed. You feel like you have such a good grasp of what's going on that you don't even realize what you're missing until the author hands it to you, until they pull back the curtain and say like, hey, there's this whole thing that you haven't even considered that we need to dive into now. And I think that Antonia Hodgson delivered that beautifully. Now, interestingly, considering I'm not somebody who actually really likes the crime genre at all, I typically don't like murder mysteries. I do read the occasional thriller, but my favorite things in fantasy are, well, books in general actually. I love world building, complicated world building, intricate world building, slow pacing, rich atmosphere, all of which this book provided. But with books in general, not exclusive to the fantasy genre, I love to be surprised. If the plot twist shocks me, 5 stars. And this was a perfect combination of all of those things that I've just said that I love, which is why I'm pretty confident that this is going to be very high up on my best books of the year by the time we get to the end of 2026. I would have to read some spectacular books to knock this down my list. It's currently at the number 2 spot. Now, after I've just said that I neither read nor really enjoy mysteries, let me introduce you to my favorite book of March. It was a 5-star read, and it's Apples Never Fall by Liane Moriarty. This is a book of the month book. I've had it on my TBR for years, but typically book of the month mystery thrillers, they do tend to be quite highly rated, and I do sometimes like a book of that genre as a palate cleanser. So I picked this one up with little to no expectations, and I decided to listen to the audiobook. This has a very mundane synopsis, and actually a lot of this was a very mundane book, but we are following this family. Everyone in this family is an adult, so the children are all adults. I think they range from their like late 30s or mid 30s to their mid 40s. They are well into adulthood, and their parents are, I think, in their mid 60s, and they used to own a tennis school. None of the children have decided to take over the tennis school as they've grown up, and so they've sold the school off, but they are very ambitious people. They like to keep busy, and retirement actually isn't suiting them very well. One day a stranger knocks on their door and Joy lets her in. and she's more than happy to help her. And this stranger ends up staying a while, which all of Joy and Stan's children think is really weird. And it gets even weirder when Joy goes missing. This book is predominantly told in two timelines. We have now, after Joy has gone missing, and we also have last September, which is when the stranger knocked on the door. Now, for the longest time, we don't know how long ago that was because we don't know what month we are currently in, but we're essentially flicking back between these two timelines to get a picture of Joy and Stan's relationship with this mysterious stranger, but then also to get a picture of the dynamic within this family, because the children don't want to report their mother missing because they know that their father's going to be blamed for it, but they don't think he's capable of hurting their mother. But the further this story unfolds, the more unsure the children become. So one of the things that I really liked about this is that it's kind of slice of life, which is weird for me to say because if you describe a book as slice of life, I'm gonna run for a mile. I don't want to read about like your mundane day-to-day life, but for some reason it really worked for me in this book, and I think it's because everybody's day-to-day, everybody's current circumstances help to build this really like rich tapestry of family life for the Delaney's, and it delves into stuff that happened like years and years ago when they were kids. It delves into the dynamics between the siblings, the like love that we have between them, but also the jealousy, the rivalry, things that happened to them when they were a lot younger that has like stuck with them into adulthood. They also all have a complicated relationship with tennis, being raised by people who are not only amazing at tennis, but like I said, are really ambitious, driven people. And if you asked any of these kids, they would say their parents' marriage was perfect, their family life was perfect, that they had this beautiful, privileged life. But as you delve into it, you find out that that's maybe not the case, or it's a lot more complicated than that, or it's not as perfect as it appears on the surface. And the plot twist at the end of this, I wasn't expecting it. I actually really liked the way that this unfolded. It was almost underwhelming, but it also really worked. And the beauty of this book is almost the process, because when it comes to books of this genre, especially like thrillers, I typically want the plot twist to blow me away. That is what I'm hanging on. But the interesting thing about this one is that I found I was more interested in peeling back the layers of this family than I was resolving the mystery. And even though there wasn't necessarily a lot going on, I was still really hooked. One of the things that I actually really like that Liane Moriarty does in here is that for a while we only get the viewpoint of the children through the lens of other people. So I think like the prologue or the first chapter of this book is where they've all gathered in like a diner or a cafe or a restaurant or something like that, and the waitress is trying to take their order, but they're all discussing what has happened to their mother. So we're getting the waitress's perspective on the conversation that they're having. Little things like that throughout here gave this book the element of gossip. It was almost like I was hearing a lot of people talking about this family, and I could revel in it and kind of soak up all these tidbits of information as somebody who is like casually invested, knows who they are, is aware of them, but not invested enough that like Joy's disappearance is happening to me or is affecting my life. So I think that the layers in here, combined with the fact that it felt like I was listening to gossip, especially through the audiobook, is what made this such an enjoyable reading experience for me. Probably won't be on my best books of the year list, but when I'd finished this, I honestly couldn't say a negative thing about it, so 5 stars. For April, we have the book that is currently holding my top spot of the year, which is Rights of the Starling by Devney Perry. This is also a sequel, and we love to see it. I feel like I've done a really good job at wrapping up some series, keeping it on top of some things, and also not starting too many series this year, which you will see when we get to the part of my mid-year content where we talk about all of those series that I've started, finished, DNF'd, and so on and so forth. But Rights of the Starling was a very anticipated book for me this year because it was the follow-up to one of my favorite books of last year, which is of course Shield of Sparrows. And it has been the longest time since I have given 2 books in a romantasy series back to back 5 stars. I have been so frequently disappointed by sequels recently that I'm so happy that this one held up. If you're unfamiliar with Shield of Sparrows, it is a romantic romantasy series set in this world where every generation this migration of giant eagle-like monsters flies over the land and completely decimates anything that they touch. So many years ago, there was a treaty put in place called the Shield of Sparrows, which essentially binds the human kingdoms together through marriage so that they are allied to each other instead of fighting against each other, so that everyone instead can focus on surviving the migration when it rolls around. Now, our main character is this generation Sparrow, and she wasn't supposed to be, it was supposed to be her younger sister. However, when a delegation from the country that her sister was supposed to marry into come to visit the kingdom that she lives in, they exploit a loophole that allows them to choose the princess that will fulfill the treaty, and they choose our main character instead. And then she finds out that her father has actually been training her younger sister her entire life to infiltrate this kingdom and find out where their capital city is, knowledge that he allegedly is seeking so that he can help to stop the migrations for good. However, our main character has never had an amazing relationship with her father, so she doesn't quite believe him, especially as when she travels to this other kingdom, she very quickly starts to fall in love with it and its people, and unfortunately she also starts to fall for the kingdom's famed monster hunter, who is not her husband, the crown prince. So one of the things that I loved about Shield of Sparrows is that it lulled me into a false sense of security with all these very common, very familiar romantasy tropes. We have the arranged marriage, we have a princess kind of prepared to infiltrate an enemy kingdom under the guise of marriage. We also have the evil king figure, the evil father, who is manipulating the main character, so she has to decide whether she betrays her family or whether she betrays these new people that she's coming to care for. All of these are things that I've read 100 times before, but I feel like Devney Perry used these as a setup, like a building block, to really delve into something more unique. I really loved the monsters that we have in here because we don't just have these eagles. Monsters are a regular part of this world, and a big key part of this plot is that there is something happening to the monsters that our main character teams up with the monster hunter, who's called the Guardian, to get to the bottom of, because it's causing the monsters to behave more erratically. And through this partnership we learn a lot more about the world. The monsters themselves as well are kind of like modeled off regular creatures, but then they also have some sort of like reptilian element to them, which I thought was really interesting. And I really liked that Devney Perry just kept expanding upon the plot and adding extra layers. So we have like, why does her father want to know where the capital is? What is wrong with the monsters? How do we stop this migration for good? And all of these like little extra elements of the plot build in on top of each other. Now, with Rise of the Starling, I really expected Devney Perry to kind of continue down the path that she set up for herself at the end of Shield of Sparrows, but instead of progressing the plot, which is what I typically expect from romantasy sequels, we normally take the first book as setup, which typically like develops the world, gets you acquainted with the characters, and then the next two books, if it's a trilogy, deal with what the actual plot of the series is going to be. But instead of continuing to develop the plot, in Rise of the Starling, Devney Perry actually takes a step back and she further develops the world. And once again, it's a case of continuously peeling back layers of this world and finding more underneath, which I love. I love a rich, expansive, complex world. Like, give me more world building. Always. I would read a book this size just about a fantastical world if we also had like compelling characters that I really cared about as well, because if it's just about the world and I'm not attached to anything, that's a little less interesting. But I would rather you told me about the world than you gave me a plot. If I'm being honest, if I had to pick between the two, I would pick the world every single time. And not only did Devney Perry do that, she took us on a journey that I was not expecting by introducing a new character perspective in here that keeps you guessing the entire way through. But I think my favorite thing that this book achieves is that it adds so much more dimension and fleshes out a character that is typically a two-dimensional cookie cutter caricature that just serves as a like archetype to fulfill a certain role in a plot. And that's all I can tell you without kind of giving it away or telling you kind of what type of character this entails. But I really enjoyed this one, and once again, like with Shield of Sparrows, this book took me by surprise. I did guess, like, the more we got into this book, the more I kind of cottoned on to what was going on. But I am still kind of amazed that Devney Perry not only went down this route, but also managed to pull it off. That even though I wasn't completely surprised, I still feel like the plot twist deserves a ton of merit. And I also think that Devney Perry did a really good job of maintaining romantic tension throughout this book, because typically in romantasy we have characters that get together in book one and then I kind of get bored of them in the sequels because, you know, they're a done deal, there's less tension there. The events of this book, I feel like, really put some realistic tension within their relationship that I also really appreciated and kept me invested in that element of this story as well. My favorite book of May has probably the best character work that I've read all year, and it is also a sequel, and that is Human Rights by Juno Dawson, the final book in the Her Majesty's Royal Coven trilogy, which is a series that I have consistently enjoyed, aside from the prequel novella, but that is a novella, which, you know, short things don't always work for me, but the core installments of this series I have loved. And this is an adult contemporary fantasy series that is predominantly set in the north of England, following 4 women who grew up together in Hebden Bridge. So they were very close, they're all witches, and they formed their first coven together. However, when this series starts, they are in their early to mid 30s, and a lot has happened to them up until the point where we're first introduced to them. For example, in the early to mid 20s, they were all heavily involved in a war between the witches and the warlocks of the world, which has left its scars on all of them. In the present day, one of our dominant characters, Helena, who is the High Priestess of Her Majesty's Royal Coven, which is the governing body of witches, gets in touch with her childhood friend Neve because there is a prophecy that says that the Sully child is going to summon a demon that brings about the end of the days, and Helena thinks that she has found this child. They are incredibly volatile, they're currently very like uncooperative, non-verbal, and so she calls Neve and asks if Neve can rehabilitate this child, being somebody whose magic like heavily leans into empathy. She's currently working as a vet where she uses her ability to kind of sense what's going on with animals and heal them better. She's a great person, is Neve, honestly. And so Neve takes this child in. One of the things that I love about this series in general is that it is incredibly diverse and it is not shy about the messaging that it is putting forward, but at the same time it remains to be a fantasy series with a compelling fantasy plotline, which I think is really important, because I do find that books can either fall into one of two camps these days. There's either no message being put forward, there is nothing underneath the text, like it is solely just a story for enjoyment, or the political, the societal messaging can be so heavy-handed that it distracts away from the fact that it is a fictional book with a plot. And I feel like Juno Dawson does a really good job of maintaining the balance between the two, so you can still enjoy this as a fantasy story, but then you can also really dive into and think on what Juno Dawson is saying about society throughout the entirety of this series as well. But my favorite thing about this series, and this book especially, is how realistic these characters are. They are so layered, and I love that. When we enter into this series, these women have already been through a lot. They have already essentially lived the plotline of a fantasy series by participating in the war between the witches and the warlocks. Each of them have suffered because of that war, albeit in very different ways, and the scars of that war they have carried with them for the last 10 years, which is very apparent when reading from their perspective. On top of everything that has already happened to them before we even meet them in this series, a lot goes down in here. Something that's really fun about this series is that Juno Dawson wears her influences on her sleeve, and Juno Dawson is a huge Buffy fan. So not only do we have a few references and homages to Buffy within here, but we also have some zany, chaotic, out-of-pocket events that only happen in places like supernatural TV shows like Buffy, like Charmed. And as I said, the 90s nostalgia in this one is also pretty strong. We have Spice Girls references, and it is like a blend of a bunch of fun stuff, but also like a very serious storyline on top of that as well. So not only do we have a bunch of terrible things happening to these women, we also have all of this like crazy, spontaneous, magical stuff that's popping up in really quick succession as the events of this plot and the events of this prophecy unfold. All things that they have to deal with, take in their stride, and not move on from in terms of like process and move on from, but like set aside and move on to be able to deal with everything else that is currently being thrown at their way. And I feel like Juno Dawson did not only a great job of portraying like adult women in their 30s, but also specifically British women. And I would even go as far as to say Northern British women. And I really loved the note that this ended on as well, because we didn't have everything wrapped up in a bow, but there was also a sense of that being okay that I really appreciated, because in life, you don't just get over bad things that happen to you, you carry them with you. Even if you process that trauma and that grief, it's still something that you carry with you. And I feel like all of these women really accurately represented that, and represented that as you go through life, like the more you experience, the more you change as a person, as each event turns into kind of like a layer that helps to develop who you are. So while I have a lot of great things to say about this series in general, the characters are 100% the shining star of this series for me. And then for June, I did struggle a little bit because I had 3 very strong 4-star reads that I loved for very different reasons. But I have decided that epic fantasy is a little bit underrepresented on this list so far. And so my favorite book of June goes to The Crown Conspiracy by Michael J. Sullivan, which is the first book in the Rhaenyra Revelations and also the first book in Theft of Swords. So this is a 6-book series, but in published physical format, it is 3 volumes, each containing 2 books each. So in June, I just decided to dive into the first half of this, which is just 310 pages. Now, I was a little bit nervous because when it comes to epic fantasy, I like my books thick. I like my books thick in general, but when it comes to epic fantasy, you know, I want that slow build, that deep world development that we've been talking about. And this is a very different introduction to an epic fantasy series, because this is following a thief and mercenary duo who go by Rhaenyra. And in this first book, they accidentally get wrapped up in royal politics when they are framed for the murder of the king. So the interesting thing about this series and the way that it starts out is that it just really throws you in there and hooks you immediately with the characters of Royce and Hadrian. So Hadrian is the mercenary. He is an expert swordsman. He's also very friendly. He's very lighthearted. He wants to help people. And Royce is the thief. He grew up on the streets. He was an orphan. It's hinted at that he was a prisoner at some point in this prison that nobody ever escaped from. However, somehow he is out here roaming the world, and he is very serious. He's a lot less trusting than Hadrian, and it's very much like a Labrador black cat pairing. We have a lot of humor in this book as well, mainly in the dialogue, which I have noticed is my preferred humor in fantasy. I don't like the events of the plot to be taken lightly. I like that to be quite serious, but if we have rapport or banter between characters, if the language is humorous within the dialogue, that is something I can definitely get behind, especially when we have a really great pairing like Royce and Hadrian that kind of bounce off each other constantly. The other interesting thing about this, and probably the reason why I gave this 4 stars as opposed to 5, is that this is a self-contained story. So the assassination plot, the murder that Royce and Hadrian are framed for, wraps up within this first book. I do believe that there are threads that we are introduced to in this first book that branches off into some of the plot lines for later books in this series. And I've only read book 1 at this point, so I don't know if every installment is a self-contained plot with some overarching themes. But this reads more like a fun action adventure, like swashbuckling kind of story with compelling characters that are instantly lovable. It also had some elements of The Princess Bride for me. I haven't read the book yet, but in terms of the movie, like some of the action scenes were given like Wesley in The Princess Bride, or you know, like the scene in Pirates of the Caribbean where the big water wheel comes free and like they're sword fighting on top of it. Some of the scenes really had that like level of flamboyance to them. But what I really loved that Michael J. Sullivan did with this world is he drew you in really quickly with these characters, and very shortly after you start this book you get thrown into the plot. So you have something at the forefront of this book that is kind of like spurring it onwards and also providing structure, but then you also have little tidbits and hints to the wider world. We get some information in here as to what maybe happened thousands of years ago in this world. We get some information on some of the races that used to be present in this world, some big historic events that changed the landscape of the world for the times to come. And it's those elements that I think we are going to dive into more in the rest of the series, because this is also the start of like a world as well. It's not just this series. There's more than one series set in the same world. And what I really really liked, even though it isn't my personal preference, is that I feel like Michael J. Sullivan doesn't overface you with all of this information of how the world used to be and its origins and the magic and all of this like background stuff. He draws you in with the present and then feeds you the past and the extra information as you're going along, not detracting from the current plot line, but also hinting that there's something more to be discovered there if you keep on reading. So while I could walk away from this series, I know who killed the king, we got to the bottom of all of that, I'm gonna come back because I want to know more about the other stuff. I want to know more about what's going on in this world. And while this style of world building isn't my preference, because I like to have a good foundation of the world going into a story, like tell me everything, really go into detail about all of this stuff before we even start the plot. As somebody who is naturally curious when it comes to these elements, I'm then going to come back to find out more information. The only worry that I have with series like this is, will Michael J. Sullivan satisfy that curiosity? Will he give me that depth of knowledge that I'm craving if I persevere through this entire series? Or are we just going to continue to touch upon it without really delving into it? Now with this series, I expect it's something that is going to be developed maybe in series that don't follow Royce and Hadrian, but the only way to find out is to continue reading, and if nothing else, that is something that I definitely do plan on doing. So these are my favorite books of 2026 so far. I'm actually really sad that we don't have a sci-fi in the stack, because if we did, that would be all of my favorite genres represented. We have epic fantasy, we have romantasy, we have contemporary romance, we even have a mystery, which is wild, but I feel like a sci-fi in here would really balance it out. So maybe I should get on with that and pick up some I mean, I'm always saying I should pick up sci-fi, I always overlook it, but when I read sci-fi, I love it. So that's something that I definitely just need to do in general. But down in my comments, let me know what your guys' favorite book of the year so far is, especially if we have any in common. But if you guys would like to let me know you were here but you don't feel like you have anything to say, then please leave me a watery emoji, like the sea wave one for Deep End by Ali Hazelwood. And of course, please stay tuned if you are interested in that mid-year content, because my mid-year book freakout tag will be coming very, very shortly. But aside from that, guys, please don't forget to like this video if you liked it and subscribe if you wanna. If you head into my description box, you'll find a link to my Goodreads, my Instagram and my Patreon if you want to follow me on any of those. But that's it from me today, guys. Bye.
Oh, you bite your friend like chocolate. You say you'll go and nobody knows, with guns hidden under our petticoats. We're never gonna quit it, no, we're never gonna quit it, no.